Okay, and here is our first tutorial for today's lesson. In this first tutorial, we're going to be listing the 25 fundamental trigonometric identities. We're in section 6.3 in our textbook. We're actually going to spend a few days on this topic since it's incredibly important. The first thing I'd like to talk about are our 25 trigonometric identities. We've already looked at 13 of them. We've already done the 6 reciprocal identities. In fact, you've already made flashcards and you should already have been studying those flashcards. We've looked at the 2 quotient identities. Those are just other names for our tangent and cotangent. And we've looked at the 5 Pythagorean identities. Remember, each one of these is quantities squared, like in the Pythagorean theorem. Those are the 13 that we've already looked at, and you should already have made your flashcards and you should already be studying those. If you have not already done your flashcards, please make sure you do so as soon as possible. What I mean by a flashcard is on the front of your flashcard, you're putting the left side of each of these identities, for example, 1 minus sine squared. I use theta. You can use any angle you want if you want to use an x or an alpha or a beta. I use theta most of the time. This goes on the front. Flipping your flashcard over is the equal sign, and then on the back would be the right side of the identities, cosine squared in this case. Please make sure you have those and you're studying them. If you want to label each of them by what they are, whether they're Pythagorean or cofunction or quotient, that's absolutely fine with me. There are 12 more that we're going to introduce today. 6 of them are the cofunction identities, and they're listed right here. What the cofunction identities involve is taking your trig function and then your angle is actually 90 degrees minus theta. Or if it's in radians, it's pi over 2 minus theta. It doesn't really matter if we're talking degrees or talking radians, so that's why I did half of them in degrees and half of them in radians. But whenever you see something like this, you know that it's going to be a cofunction. And how you memorize these is pretty simple because all you do is take the sine and throw a co on it, and then you have cosine. You take the tangent and put a co on it, and now you have cotangent. Secant, put a co, you've got cosecant. Or backwards, the other 3, take the cosine, now you take the co off, and you'd be left with sine. Take the co off of cotangent, you have tangent. Take the co off of cosecant, you have secant. Those are the cofunctions and relatively simple to memorize because of the co. You're putting the co on or you're taking the co off. The other 6 are your even and odd functions. Of the 6 trig functions, 2 of them are even. The 2 that are even are the cosine and the secant. These are your 2 even functions. And what I mean by that is that their graphs are exactly symmetrical over the y-axis if you fold. Or in other words, if you put a negative angle as the input, that does not change the output. The cosine of negative angle is the same as the cosine of its positive angle. The output does not change when you put a negative input. The other 4 are odd functions, meaning that the graph would be symmetrical around the origin by a rotation. This time, if you put a negative angle in all 4 of these, you're going to get the exact opposite of what you would have gotten with the positive angle. So whenever you see a negative input, a negative angle in any of your trig functions, you need to remember which ones are even and which ones are odd and convert them to what they're supposed to be, whether it's still positive because they're even or if they're going to be negative because they're odd. Let's also look at some strategies. Oh, let's go back. There are 25. You should have 25 flashcards representing these 25 identities. And again, please study them as soon as possible and on a daily basis, maybe the first 10 minutes of pride, and you'll start to get these into your brain so that you can recognize them. Throughout the next few lessons, we're going to be simplifying trigonometric identities, expressions, and verifying these. These are some of the strategies that we will be employing. The first one, you can't get away from this. You must memorize your identities. You must be able to recognize all of your identities, the 25 that I just showed you. Substitution is going to come into play almost every single problem. Substitution is taking out something and putting something that's equivalent to it into the problem. And we'll see how we deal with that all the time. Factoring, we're actually going to look at in the next tutorial, factoring with trig functions. Sometimes it makes sense to combine fractions. Sometimes it makes sense to separate fractions. It just depends on where you're going. So we'll look at that strategy. Rationalizing, we'll look at a later tutorial. I'll explain that when we get there. Sometimes you don't know what you're supposed to do, and you might get lost, or you might not know even where to start. Sometimes converting everything into sines and cosines is a good strategy. I put a question mark because it's not always used, but it gives you something to do, and maybe you can see where you're supposed to go once you've done that. At least it gives you something to do. Um, Lastly, or one of the last things, I'd like for you to work these problems downward and not across the page. You're going to find when you're checking some of the answers in the back of the book, or back of the textbook, that their answers are typed sideways, and it's tougher to kind of follow what they're doing when they're sideways, at least in my opinion. I'm going to model always working down the page. And lastly, please do not give up. It's easy to just throw up your hands and say, I'm not going to do this one. But please do not do that. You must try something. The more you try these problems, the more it's going to make sense as to what to do. It's really about experiencing each one of these types of problems. They're all just little puzzles, and we just need to solve the puzzle. And the great thing about a puzzle is there's not one particular way to solve it. There are many different strategies to use, many different paths. Okay, thanks for watching this intro tutorial, and I'll see you in the next one.